how are you?
Nice to see you. Oh, thank you so much for everything. We appreciate it.
No problem. If it wasn't for you, I would be. Colleagues, I think we're almost there. I have a bit of a coarse voice, but I hope that I can carry. Welcome very, very much to STIAS, the creative space for the mind. I see quite a lot of us joining in this very, very seminal book launch that we're having today. And I just held it in my hands, and where I come from, they say the eyes of a person are in their hands. So before they hold something, they are not convinced, not that they don't believe, they're not convinced that it exists. So thank you very much for having this book in my hands and knowing that when I make the introductions, I'm making them for real. My name is Edward, Professor Edward Chirumira. I'm the director of STIAS. I'm a medical sociologist and also an extraordinary professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Stellenbosch University, formerly professor from Makerere University. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space. It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for the co-editors of this book, and also to my colleague and friend, Professor Jonathan Jansen, who was accepted to be the chair and discussant for this event. We try and make this within about 75 minutes. That's an hour, 15 minutes. There will be a reward for sitting and listening to these individuals, and you can see the glasses outside there. So the proceedings are going to be, I'll briefly introduce the three editors and also acknowledge the chapter authors who are physically present. I will also introduce Professor Jansen, who is our chair discussant. Jonathan will then take over with his introductory remarks on the book itself, and then start the conversation with the editors, and later with the audience. This, as I said, will take about 75 minutes. We probably can do it longer if we are very patient. And then our STIAS senior program manager, Christoph Pohl, will lead us over to the reception after the closing words by Jonathan and the panelists. So that's going to be the order. So my pleasure to introduce the three co-editors to begin with, starting with Olaf Zenker. Professor Olaf Zenker is a STIAS fellow, just like the two other co-editors are. And he was here at STIAS in 2018, 2019, when I first met him, when I came in 2019, and 2022. Olaf held professorships at the University of Cologne, at the Freie Universität Berlin, and the University of Freiburg in Switzerland before joining the Martin-Luther-Universität Halle-Wittenberg in Germany in 2019, where he holds a chair of social and cultural anthropology at Martin-Luther-University, focusing on Southern Africa, Northern Ireland, and Germany. His research has dealt with political legal issues such as statehood, bureaucracy, legal pluralism, inequality, and land justice. And perhaps he'll reflect on what is going on, what we're waiting for on Wednesday. But Jonathan has already invited us to vote. I think those that have been following him have seen that call, and there was a 95% yes response, which was very encouraging. Cherryl, on the other hand, is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Stellenbosch University. Her research interests include the sociology and history of land and land reform in South Africa and the wider region. She also has an interest in critical cosmopolitanism as a lens through which to explore dynamics of the Karoo, and we were honored to have her and Zsa-Zsa in residence and got to know more about the Karoo. When people come to South Africa, you always hear the Karoo, and you wonder whether it's another state. Cherryl here would very well guide you through that. She was awarded the Research Chair in Sociology of Land, Environment, and Sustainable Development in January 2016, which was renewed at the end of 2020 for a second term of 2021-2025. And I think they have a third term as well. She's a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa and serves on the editorial advisory board of the Journal of Southern African Studies, the Southern African Journal of Science, and the Journal of Peace Studies. So all of you who are writing up some articles, you know where to send them to. Her career, however, has also spanned the academic, state, and the NGO sector. Zsa-Zsa, on the other hand, who is patiently waiting for me to introduce her, is a professor of law at Stellenbosch University, and her area of interest includes a range of topics in the field of property law, as well as constitutional property and property theory. So I think she was the theorist behind this book. From March 2018 to December 2022, she was the incumbent of the South African Research Chair in Property Law, Tier 1, under the NRF South African Research Chairs Initiative. And so she continues to work in that field very, very actively. Other chapter authors here present, and if you will, please put up your hand so that we can recognize you. Bulerwa Mabasa and Thomas Kabe. They are two of the three co-authors of Chapter 2, and both are lawyers working at the land reform practice area at Vexmarks Attorneys. Then we have Juanita Piena, right there, author of Chapter 4 and a professor in private law as well as vice dean at the Faculty of Law of Stellenbosch University. Welcome. We have Ruth Hull, there you go, author of Chapter 6 and South African Research Chair in Poverty, Land, and Agrarian Studies at the Institute for Poverty, Land, and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape. Vishas Satgar, there author of Chapter 10 and Associate Professor of International Relations at WITS. Welcome. I think it's better here than in WITS. May I now introduce the chair discussant, Professor Jonathan Jansen. It's a very difficult way to introduce my friend here, just it's been with the three. But I say that Jonathan is Distinguished Professor in Education at Stellenbosch University and has had a very long and distinguished career. Many of us may not know that Jonathan started his academic journey with a BSc in Botany and Zoology majors at the University of Western Cape. He went on, though, to complete his university studies with a PhD from School of Education at Stanford University, with UNISA and Cornell University in between. His significant and ever-permanent presence in the South African higher education space started way back in 1991 as a member Council for Curriculum Development Independent Examinations Board, which eventually culminated in his 2005 ministerial appointment to the board of the South African Council of Education, and he's been in that space all along. Among his accolades, he has been the president of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and last year was inducted as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. While commenting on one of the community drives he has spearheaded, Jonathan is quoted as saying, "The wonderful thing about South Africa is that people want to know what they can do to help." It is pleasing, therefore, that he accepted to chair and discuss today's book launch on Beyond Expropriation Without Compensation. Jonathan, please. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I lead a double life. I start off at 6:35 in the morning at a school that is in disrepair. It's next to the house where I grew up on the Cape Flats. And when they got the worst results in last year's matric, or NSC, I offered to help free of charge. So I worked there from 6:30 to 1, and then I drive through to Stellenbosch for my paid job. But it's two different worlds that I live in, right? So this morning we've now learned to close the gate at 8 o'clock, and then if you're not there in time, we send you home. And it's not about the gate, it's about getting discipline into the school. And I've gotten all the kids to greet each other, and we greet them, I greet. So I stood at the gate this morning and I said, good morning, Kuyamora, as they came in, and so on. And one girl didn't greet me, and I noticed her, and she walked past me, and then she said to her friend, I love school kids, and she said to her friends, because I was obviously, they're all greeting now, and she says, "Ek groet u eers my ma nie." I don't even greet my mother. What's wrong with this buffoon, you know, etc. So I live two worlds, and then I come into this very sophisticated space and this beautiful occasion here at STIAS, and it's a different world. It's also a different world for me in another sense. I'm a curriculum theorist. You know, I deal with problems of knowledge, of epistemology, of the politics of knowledge. In schools and universities. So when I read a book on the land question, you must understand, I feel like a total idiot amongst many of you who obviously have engaged this question very deeply and sincerely for many years. But maybe that's an advantage, because I'm going to ask them questions that are the questions of a guy who works at a school, you know, and ask very simple questions of the reality around us and so on. So they gave me a list of questions. I said, Zsa-Zsa, you're out of your mind. I can't read you questions that A, are very boring. You know, we've got to keep the audience engaged. And B is very, very academic. So forgive me if I'm going to get down this evening and just ask them questions that will make them squirm. I make no mistake. And the questions don't necessarily mean I believe that I have an answer, because the one thing I recognize about this work is that these are very difficult issues to deal with, not just emotionally and politically, but also intellectually. It's hard questions. And so I told my research assistant just before I came over, just remember, if I taught you anything while you work with me, it's how to ask questions this side of complexity. Because too many South Africans ask questions on the other side of complexity, and they haven't really thought it through. That simplicity, I want to deal with simple. So let me just say something about the book. This is an amazing book. I've read it 4 times now. One, I was just reminded to write a shout out at the back of the book. I actually forgot that I wrote the shout out. And when I read the shout out, I say, you bloody idiot, you disagree with everything you just wrote here. But this was months ago, right? So it's not my fault that people ask me to write way ahead of time. But what I like, and I want to say to my 3 colleagues here, this is an amazing book. And I tell you why. First of all, it's a book written with passion. There is a passion here which inflames and their scholarship. And you cannot do anything for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever your field of study, unless you are passionate about it. And there's passion. The second thing is, as I said in the shout-out, there's a lucidity that I really appreciate. They really make things clear, even for a non-expert, in the area of land reform. And that means that the book will travel and should travel beyond the confines of university campuses. So thank you also for that. But the third thing I want to just say, there is a humanity to this work. You know, when I drive into the city, as I did this weekend, into the center of the city of Cape Town, and just as you cross over that bridge before you dip into the waterfront, and you see so many people just sort of living miserable lives under these concrete blocks, that cannot be what we voted for 30 years ago. That cannot be acceptable to anyone who cares about the human project. And for that, my colleagues, I want to thank you very sincerely for making this visible. And I tell you why these books are, with this I'll conclude and then I'll sit down and ask them a few questions. Why this book is so important, because it's a good mix. I'll critique it in a minute, but it's a good mix of solid intellectual work as well as activism embedded in that. And why is the activism component important? You know, as watching this horrible war in Ukraine, as I do this genocide in Gaza, our senator has some difficulty understanding the word genocide, but that's another debate for another time. But I watched this war, and there was a journalist from CNN walking through the rubble, and the bombs are going off behind him, and he was quoting somebody else. I kick myself for not having recorded this, because I didn't expect it to be so good. And he says the following. He says, you know, we are often asked as journalists, why do you put yourself in harm's way? Why do you risk losing your life, you know, by going into these very difficult places where there's murder and genocide and all these kinds of things? I'll never forget what he said. He said, because if we don't cover these killings, these injustices, it is easier in the dark. It is easier in the dark. You cannot look away from this important contribution on land reform. They've opened up something that many of us would like to not think about, and made it very difficult for us to work in the dark without the light of this incredible intellectual work. So, before I go any further, please give a round of applause to our editors and authors in the audience. From here on, it gets a little bit more unpleasant, but let's, yeah, thanks for taking that away so that I can see the right wing on the side. So I first want to deal with sort of just, if the three of you don't mind, some conceptual issues, because I think it's important for the uninitiated to at least know what you mean by some of these key terms. So I've got two of them. You decide, as we discussed in preparing for this evening, which one of you responds to which question. Leave it up to you. Respond to each other, to follow up if you wish, and so on. Expropriation without compensation. What the hell is that? And while you're talking about that, what is no compensation? I believe there's been a history to these terms, but just for the sake of our audience, I think you can't read this book unless you have a good grip on EWC, and following on that, no compensation. Talk to us, not as lawyers, but as good thinkers.
Guess everyone's looking at me.
Zsa-Zsa.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think it's important to perhaps start off at that kind of conceptualization, because I do think that in the last while, the debates around expropriation without compensation, there has been a lot of misconception about, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about expropriation without compensation. And I think a lot of the contributions within the book actually do address, to some extent, the sort of meaning of expropriation without compensation, and the difference between what we talk about when we say this notion of the state acquiring ownership without any obligation to pay compensation, as opposed to there is an obligation to pay compensation, but the compensation can be nil in some instances. There are two different conversations. I think the former one, so EWC, and I'm trying to explain this, I'm sticking with your simplicity now. A lot of the debates around that were centered around whether it is possible to conceptualize this form of interference with property rights without any compensation being part of the discussion. And now for lawyers, that would essentially be more deprivation, which is in section 25(1) of the Constitution, where there's no obligation to pay any compensation. Whereas I think the discussion around expropriation at nil compensation assumes that this type of interference will require an obligation to pay compensation. It may just, in some instances, be null. The question is just which instances are null. And I think what we have, for instance, now on the table in terms of the expropriation bill envisages expropriation at null compensation. So there is still, obviously also in line with Section 25, the obligation to pay compensation. It is just a question of, are there particular instances that would justify zero, null amount of compensation? And then I think this conversation, this debate about what is just and equitable compensation then sort of comes onto the table. So I do think, like I said, I think the expropriation without compensation discussion, the lead up to the Presidential Advisory Panel dealt explicitly with this as well. You know, what does our Constitution actually say when it comes to, or imply, you know, what is implicit and what is explicit? What does it actually say when we talk about this idea of this notion of compensation? And we know, of course, that we now have it has failed. The constitutional amendment has failed, and what we now have on the table is something different, I think, conceptually different to what we had on the table when we had expropriation without compensation.
Yeah. While I have you there, before I ask the others, just again for those who are not into the land debates, just take us, what's the status quo at the moment? There was a movement to have this, a constitutional amendment.
Yes.
That failed to pass because of the 2/3 majority not being met. And that legislation is sort of back in a different form. Just tell us where that process is at the moment.
Yeah, so I think it's important, again, conceptually to distinguish two things. The one is the amendment of Section 25 and the questions around what does Section 25 say and can it be amended? And that, the constitutional amendment has failed, right? So that's one aspect of it. What we have on the table now is the expropriation bill, which we envisage will be signed in to become legislation, and that would be the legislation that regulates expropriation of property. And within this legislation, this new bill, if you will, there are instances that are introducing the notion of nil compensation in certain limited instances, but it definitely introduces the concept of nil compensation, which does not currently explicitly is provided for in Section 25. And I'm using my words carefully here because I think there's a lot of talk around what is implicit and what is explicit, and I don't think there's necessarily consensus when it comes to what is explicit and what is implicit. That those are two separate processes, although a lot of people would argue that there are obviously touch points when it comes to questions around, what does Section 25 currently allow? What does the failure of the amendment to Section 25, what is that process? How far has that brought us in terms of kind of consensus building on our understanding of what is just and equitable compensation? And then in a separate, yet I would argue related, you have the expropriation bill, which is of course now on the president's table, and we are yet to see whether that's going to be signed and all of the potential kind of what happens after that.
And that requires a simple majority to pass?
It does, yes.
Okay, let me ask the other two of you. Feel free to weigh in on the first question if you wish. Again, here is another phrase that I think if you don't understand it, you can't understand the book, or let alone the legal issues, as I tried to. Just and equitable. Now, this does sound to me like a little bit of oxymoron, but let's stick with this. What is just and equitable? And can you please give attention, one of you, to both concepts?
Is this on? I can start. I just wanted to say about the issue about beyond, well, EWC. It's also a political slogan. So I think we also need, we might want to unpack that. So, and at its best, I think it has meant issues around speeding up land reform and bringing about land justice. But it's also been a way of mobilizing a political constituency as well. So I think one needs to understand that, and much of the debate around the constitutional amendment sort of toggled between those imperatives, because you had lawyers and politicians and policymakers discussing the Constitution and what was possible and what was not possible, and then you had a politics that obviously they bled into each other as well, which resulted in what Zsa-Zsa was just explaining. And then, of course, our book is also about beyond expropriation without compensation. So we try to move the debate on land and land justice beyond that focus, which maybe brings us to the just and equitable. So, I mean, just and equitable was a phrase that, was being discussed at our constitutional negotiations. And it was a way of trying to, in relation to property and land, it was, and compensation, it was saying that it's one of the considerations for, if you are going to bring about a land dispensation that is just, is fair, and equitable, recognizing that we have a very inequitable land dispensation, that we inherited that. And then giving content to that, I suppose, has been the issues. What does that actually mean in a given context?
Maybe following up on that, first of all, with regard to the constitutional amendment, I think it's important to point out also that at the time, even when the amendment process was ongoing, many specialists were contesting the necessity to amend the Constitution in the first place, arguing that expropriation without compensation, or rather expropriation with nil compensation in certain cases, was already covered by the Constitution as it stands. So the failed amendment process as such doesn't necessarily mean that the argument for nil compensation requires the expropriation bill to begin with, but maybe was already covered by the Constitution. So that, I think, is up for also the Constitutional Court in the end to decide. and probably there will be litigation with the expropriation bill coming now. Following up on the just and equitable compensation, or the phrasing, as Cherryl was pointing out, I think you need to charge the drafters of the Constitution rather than us poor people writing this book, because that's of course a phrase that's written into the Section 25 in terms of compensation. It has to be just and equitable. And I think there's also this kind of oscillation in the debate between becoming very technical and focusing on the specificities of expropriation and the factors that determine just and equitable compensation according to Section 25, and now also with, I think, Section 12, Section 3 in the expropriation bill, allowing for nil compensation, and seeing the larger picture, which is basically what we try to do with this book, to argue that ultimately all these debates on expropriation without compensation, on land reform, and also beyond should be directed and redirected towards questions of redistributive justice. I mean, that's the key term for us in this book. And that moves beyond more technical debates on just and equitable compensation in acts of expropriation towards larger questions of how to drive forward a more comprehensive form of transformative justice and change in South Africa.
Yeah, so every time I go back to my birthplace, where I didn't grow up, but at least, you know, it's a specific place, opposite the Avalon Hotel in Montague, number 2 Markstraat, to my Afrikaans cousins. I go and stand there, and there's a bit of a pain, I must say, because I knew the beauty of the family home, and and how my grandfather went blind after, you know, I think it might have been another eye disease. His daughters all thought this was, you know, a consequence of the emotional pain and so on. So these things are real for millions and millions of South Africans, as you know. There is a place, right? At the same time, 30 years later, I say to myself, do we want to go there? Because just and equitable, as I understood your own writing, means actually to express concern for all those affected, correct? And if that is the case, my question to you is, where does reconciliation fit into the EWC narrative, or is it off the table?
Well, if I may start, I think in the technical...
Yeah, see, you can go home afterwards. They have to stay here and answer these questions. Go ahead, my brother.
No, in terms of just and equitable compensation, in terms of the property clause, I think it's really about striking a balance between public interest and private interest of those affected. So in this technical language, it's really about finding a balance according to the standards there. But my sense is, and I hear that from what you are talking about, your own family background, that might actually exceed what the law is providing us. I mean, the question really is how to organize a process in which all affected parties actually sense that they are heard, that they are giving a voice to the situation which is relevant, and how to incorporate that into a political process. And I think that's really the question, how to organize that and do that with regard to expropriation without compensation, but also beyond, how to organize land reform more generally. I mean, that's also one of the big concerns we had with the book, that we might actually occlude relevant debates and injustices and senses of people not feeling being heard, not being incorporated by this highly technicized debate on a minuscule subsection of the property clause, which might actually only amount to a very few cases that fall under that.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in, I mean, and I think you touched on something in terms of how case law has actually dealt with this notion of just and equitable, which I think is important to kind of reflect upon over the years, how courts have been dealing with. I mean, we can obviously go back to Section 25 and we can go and see that it talks about balancing of the interests of the owner with the interest of the public, or public interest in a particular context. And so that is, I think, the starting point when it comes to understanding this notion of just and this notion of equitable compensation and how it will play out. But it's interesting if one looks at how courts have been dealing with, and perhaps it's kind of a testimony to how cases are brought as well and how arguments are made. But it's very interesting to see how, when one looks at how just and equitable has actually been applied in courts, it tends to favor landowners to a much greater extent in terms of vacillating. And this is something that I try to kind of provoke in my own chapter as well, is it seems to me as though courts do vacillate towards market value, which is interesting if we are looking towards reconciliation, if we are looking towards, does that then inform our understanding of what reconciliation can mean when we are seeing courts vacillate towards ownership and market value as the just and equitable standard that is going to be awarded? And it's, you know, it's also interesting if one looks at other chapters in the book, which I think I like to go back to the chapters of the book and kind of reflect on the questions that you ask in light of the, you know, what was argued. But for instance, in Almine du Plessis' book, she talks about how the expropriation without compensation debate was essentially about renegotiating what justice we are talking about when we talk about just and equitable compensation, and sort of conceives of different types of justice that could inform what we are talking about, which I don't think we don't see obviously in court cases when it plays out. But it's interesting to kind of reflect in that light of whether we are actually basically renegotiating what form of justice we are talking about when we talk about just and equitable compensation.
I think that's very perceptive, and I want to come to Cherryl on that in a minute. One of the chapters that really got my attention, which I think is actually a brilliant chapter in the book, is by a person I don't know called Dani Brandt. And Dani actually quotes Cherryl Walker and says, look, we have to narrow a view. I'm just looking for where, oh yes, of, in fact, Cherryl, you call this the master narrative of loss and restoration. And that has taken attention away from a much more fundamental human problem. Quote, how can we live together concerning land? How can we live together?
Sure. Oh, sorry. So maybe just to explain the master narrative as well. So it's something that I wrote quite a long time ago, and I think it does still inform my chapter, in fact, and which is looking at land reform from the perspective of the Karoo, which is a very marginalized part of the country, but where you have 45% of commercial farmland in the Karoo, but only 1% of the population. So what does this mean for how we think about the focus on white farmland as the prize for land redistribution? But the master narrative, what I was arguing in that was that story of dispossession and loss that you have invoked in relation to your family, which is a very, very compelling one. It doesn't deal with the complexity sufficiently of social change since people were first dispossessed. I mean, this is a kind of simplification of this, but that's the argument, and that actually when you're making land reform, land policy, and looking at land reform, and in fact what many people and the descendants of many people might be looking for now, there is, for some, a desire to return to an agrarian past. But for many, the issues are, along with that sense of loss, which I think is very difficult to assuage, that people carry that. But there's also, they're looking for something, some new opportunities. And in many cases, it's beyond land. It might be the right to the city, education, etc. And that the master narrative of loss and restoration, I was saying, which informed and still informs the land reform debate in many ways, is important, it's compelling, but it's insufficient as a basis for redistributive justice, ultimately, but also for land policy. And that's a difficult argument to make. And it's often it's a difficult argument to make in the context of the expropriation without compensation debate, which I think was a very polarizing debate. You were talking about reconciliation, but it was very polarizing, and I think that level of polarization and anger and mistrust is still very palpable today. So, and the challenge for land reform and for people who are dealing with land, and I make the distinction between the symbolic power of land, which often is tied up with actual place, but then actual land is a finite resource in 2024, with all the challenges that we are facing. So that's some of the complex issues that I think we are also trying to bring. Well, there's different voices in the book as well, different perspectives, but all, as you say, engaging with passion around what does justice look like, and how might we move to a situation where a more equitable, a more just society.
Maybe you want to take on this one. One of our brilliant young lawyers, somebody I absolutely admire, Ngugai Tumbi, asks a question that, is the EWC project worth it? There's very high political risk, and there's also very high economic / financial risk, okay? So you just come to the real world. I'd like to see all these white-owned areas around here, Stellenbosch, which is a pain to me when I drive into work every morning or every afternoon. I'd like to see a more equitable share. I'd like to have less rhetoric about the people who were thrown out of the floctacy, as they called it, you know, and some action, not to dispossess one group of South Africans or another, but to bring some form of justice, right? But you and I know if that happens in the political economy that we occupy here, there will be chaos, okay? And in fact, one guy who clearly is pulling the other way in your book, William Baynard, asked the question somewhat nervously, as an Englishman, will EWC act as a disincentive for investment? So let me say the quiet part out loud. Is Zimbabwe not a cautionary tale?
Well, that was a question for me, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure. You quote Tim Becker, and we quote him too, asking the question whether EWC was worth it. And the question is worth with regard to what? I agree that I think there's a massive need for redistribution and having a fairer share for everyone. The question is, what is the best mechanism to achieve that? And I personally am a bit skeptical that EWC is the right avenue to really take that goal further. I mean, we have a couple of chapters, especially in the third part. You can just skip on to the next slide where you can see at least some of the densely written chapters and the different parts. In part 3, where we have chapters on redistributive justice, there are also interventions by 3 scholars who are trying to think about beyond the narrow confines of expropriation without compensation. And there are ways of how that could be achieved without engaging in expropriation for nil compensation for particular pieces of land, which I think might be more promising. One example, the chapter by Heinz Klug, who's writing about wealth taxes and making a comparative analysis of transformational taxes around the world, including my home country, West Germany, which is not necessarily famous for socialist reformist endeavors, which engaged in such a form of capital levy between 1949 and 1979 and massively redistributed funding on the basis of a capital levy where funds and capital that was existent was then taken as the base for massive redistribution. So I think there are ways of doing that within the confines of the Constitution without having to change the Constitution, which might be working faster and more effectively than to try to expropriate individual pieces of land for nil compensation, which are probably ending up in endless litigation and which will cost time and a lot of money and might not actually make that much of a contribution. Another argument made in that part 2 by James Ferguson is to start to rethink what does it mean to reclaim one's land. I mean, there's the immediacy of reclaiming the land that you used to inhabit, that you lost, that you were dispossessed of. But there's also the broader land of South Africa as a country and how to imagine being part of the community of South Africa. And he argues that we should conceive citizens as shareholders, holders of rightful shares in the wealth of the nation, and that this needs to be redistributed in various forms. And one avenue of doing that would be through basic income grants. Or there are arguments by Vish, who's in the audience tonight, about questions of food sovereignty covenants and rethinking the way of land holdings, how they are being actually managed and maintained. And I think it's really important to broaden the scope, even though we took as a springboard the expropriation without compensation debate, to think about what is this debate after all about. I think it's about redistributive justice and how to make that happen what you want to see. and to think about what are the best ways to do that. And I personally am a little bit skeptical that expropriation without compensation is really playing the trick there.
Maybe if I can come in, and Olaf, we've been having many conversations over the last years and sort of sometimes at loggerheads with regard to sort of how I see and some of, I think, what came out also in the first part of the book about maybe not the no question of expropriation without compensation was not useful or was not valuable for a number of reasons, because there are other issues that we also need to think about, not either or, but and both. But I think what comes out in the law section, perhaps, shall I call it the law section? The rights and wrongs of property section, the first part, is perhaps what the expropriation without compensation debate neglected to do. And I think it's a different question to was it valuable or useful? Because I think there are a number of chapters there, including Brandt, including Carberg, Zsa-Zsa, and Mabasa, that show, and Juanita Pina's chapter, that show quite clearly that the existing property law paradigm is also problematic for a number of different reasons. And I think we need to recognize that also, if not explicitly coming out through the expropriation without debate, definitely being kind of spotlighted to say that there are actually a number of issues that come out with regard to security of tenure, the transformative potential of Section 25 not being realized in certain contexts, some rights not being recognized because of our focus on ownership and individual exclusive ownership. There are some rights that are just not recognized. And so for me, in the broader question of whether the expropriation without compensation debate was useful or not, I think it is a difficult question, and I don't think there's a yes or no answer. But I do think that there's also a lot that came out in terms of the existing property regime that is highly problematic at the core of what we are dealing with when we are focusing our attention on individual owners, when we are focusing our attention on exclusivity of ownership, which I think came out quite clearly. Also in a number of the other chapters. I mean, I think of Ruth's chapter of our focus on the acquisition question when we haven't even given enough thought to the redistribution question. And I can go on, and I think there are a number of contributions that kind of show that from the inside, perhaps there's a sort of implosion that's taking place in terms of our thinking around notions of property, and that for me was I think I'm hesitant to say this, but a valuable exercise in the last while of kind of rethinking what those paradigms and those issues.
Yeah. Do you want to weigh in on this as well, Cherryl?
I suppose. I mean, it seems that, and I'm not a lawyer, but it was very interesting engaging with legal scholars and the arguments around different kinds of justice and different understandings of justice that are underpinning the Constitution more broadly, not just in relation to land. But it seems that one of the concerns that is also expressed in the book is that the focus on expropriation without compensation, on the constitutional amendment, on the failed constitutional amendment, and then on the bill, also obscured a whole lot of other land issues that are important. And one of the most glaring ones, perhaps, is tenure security in the former Bantustans, the communal areas. And we have a chapter, Sindiso Mnisi Weeks chapter on that, which is a small area of the country, in terms of total area, but a large percentage of the population are living there, and this is a highly contentious issue, and we're seeing it playing out around the land debates in relation to the political parties and some of the manifestos at the moment, and that is something that we're really needing to tackle, and is highly contentious in terms of the rights of people, and that I would argue is recognized in the Constitution to their land, customary land, vis-a-vis the traditional authorities and traditional councils and their rights. And that's very contested and very difficult, extremely complicated, I think, to untangle, but a major issue if one's looking at land reform. To me, the expropriation without compensation debate is to some extent over. I mean, the constitutional amendment failed. There was a majority in Parliament that supported it, but it didn't get the 2/3 majority that was required to amend the Constitution. And I think the Expropriation Act, as it stands, it's not yet an act. It's interesting that it wasn't, as far as I understand, rushed. The President didn't look for a pen, a special pen to sign that one, in contrast to the National Health Insurance Act. And it's interesting to think why, but he didn't. It's sitting on his desk as well. So that's been kind of, but it's, to me, that's not such a major concern, the way in which expropriation has been dealt with. All countries have an Expropriation Act, and land reform has been recognized. I think it's broadly recognized as an important, as in the public interest. So we need to start, post-Wednesday, we're still needing to tackle major issues around land reform, and I would say the tenure security in the Bantustans is an important one. Another very important area is urban land reform, and which is a very small part of the country, our metropolitan areas in terms of area, but that's where most of the wealth and where now some 2/3 of the population are living. So we need to start thinking about those issues, and then more broadly, how much of the rightful share, if we're talking about that, how much in terms of national budgets, etc., how much goes to land reform, the commitments that we already have made that we need to see through, how much to all the other demands on the fiscus.
Yeah, and as you guys say in the book, that most cases of restitution actually did involve compensation, which is very interesting. I didn't know that. And the other issue, of course, worth saying, of course, is very uncomfortable for people to say in South Africa, but the fact that land and land control is in black hands doesn't mean black people are going to get a fair shake. And there's some examples referenced in the book. Apropos of that point, I want to ask you why there isn't in this book, given where we are 30 years later, a systematic analysis of two issues. There's a reference to it. One is state capacity, and the other is corruption. Why are you dodging those issues? Okay. I'm talking about a systematic, listen to me, I'm not saying you don't refer to it. It's like talking about the NHI bill and actually believing the government that this is going to solve the problems of health. Have you been asleep for 30 years? Okay, this is another pot of money, you know, when everything else runs dry. You've seen this in the municipalities. They send the municipal people onto councils of universities like Fort Hare because they ran out of money, so you look for the next pot of money. Why, Olaf, Zsa-Zsa, Cherryl, isn't there a systematic analysis of the two elephants in the room? Capacity and corruption.
I can start to grapple with the two elephants in the room and then hand over to my friends. I feel as being back in school with you nasty questions. Well, the simple answer would be, first of all, there are many good analyses around already, and I don't think that we cannot accomplish them here. And then the other thing is maybe really turning the question around, yes, corruption and state capacity is a big issue, but it's not the entire story. I think many of the problems we see in land reform have to do with many of the aspects that we are covering in the book, and I think they are worthwhile to be covered separately and in detail. They all presuppose, and I think we also say that in the introduction, of course, if we make recommendations, as many others have done, of how to improve the situation with land reform, that always presupposes a state in the background which would be actually capable of putting that into practice. So, of course, we are based our entire argument on a counterfactual, right? Because we assume that there is such a state, which we just need to inform about how to best organize the policies, and then everything will be fine. Evidently, that's not the case. But then I wonder, is that still our duty to engage with the specificities of state failure and lack of capacity, or should that be left to those who are really specializing in that field, and rather we should focus on what we are best positioned to do, namely to engage with the nitty-gritty details of land reform and property law, and I think that's what we try to do in this book.
No, you're not going to get away with that. I mean, the argument wasn't that this is a specialist, field, let me not say discipline. Mm-hmm. The argument is it clearly has applications within all of the Department of State, right? It has applications in education. I just wrote a book about this in higher education, on corruption in higher education. So it's not somebody else, it's not the governance people. That's why I'm asking, why didn't you guys think about pulling this through also in the case of land reform. Anyway, let me ask the other two colleagues to weigh in.
Well, a book comes out of a process, as you will know, in terms of a conference and who's there and who's available at the time to write certain things. But I think we do address the issue of state capacity. And I think we also recognize that we do need, the state is a very important player and will be, has been, and will continue to be. And we need the state at different levels. So I think that is recognized, and then the problem of capacity and corruption is acknowledged as an issue as well. But at the same time, so we're also needing to look at rebuilding the state. And one of the points I think we make in the introduction is sort of the challenge of, I mean, one of the issues is the deficit of trust as well, I think, that we kind of flag, which also makes the debate so polarized and might make, for instance, I'm thinking aloud now, Heinz's chapter, you know, on the question of a wealth tax, to raise that as lucidly and rationally as he does, and with all the examples that he proposes, the response from individual taxpayers and corporate taxpayers is, you know, we don't trust the state at this point. We might trust STIAS as an institution to some extent, but given the history of corruption, etc., you know, they don't want to go near the idea of a tax, additional taxation. So trust is an issue, but I think we do need a state. We do need a state that is capable. I would also be hesitant to just give a blanket condemnation of the state all the way through as well. I think that also can be dangerous and defeatist. And think, you know, where can we, how can we improve, how can one strengthen state capacity? But yes, it's also about being pragmatic, which I think you were also talking about in terms of the choices you have to make. Where to start?
Yeah, I certainly understand how edited books come to life. And one of the ways they come to life is to say, what are the 6 or 7 key issues without which we cannot address this topic? And that's where I was coming from. But I want to conclude, because I want to have the audience come in. I want to ask you guys a question, a final question. I'll drop some of the others, because this is, for me, a very important issue. I'm going to read this because I don't want to misquote myself here. Has the land question become a symbol for something else? That is to say, in the absence of meaningful reform of a settled capitalist economy under which all of us labor, the land issue, as we've seen to the north, can become a lightning rod for what we have failed to deliver in terms of the basic needs of citizens. In other words, it's not really about the land, it's a stand-in for us not being able to deal with just the basic needs of our citizens, and so on and so forth. Is that a possibility for how one could read the debates on land? I don't think Julius Malema thinks very much about the land question, but he realizes it, just like that this is a lightning rod for other things. Just like I don't think that these bloody xenophobes in these smaller political parties, I don't actually think they care a damn about foreign nationals, but they know if I raise that issue, I can get the attention of rogues in our society who would want to burn alive a Mozambican, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? So is there, I know you use the word symbolism in a different way when you talk about land, but I'm talking about it as a stand-in for other issues, politically speaking.
May I make a proposal? Maybe we reconvene in half an hour and then we read our written answer to your question. I think the answer to your question would probably be a yes and no. I think, of course, the land question can be used and has been used as a political smokescreen for other issues that have not been sufficiently addressed. But I think it's dangerous. Sorry, but I think it's dangerous to fall in this either-or trap. I think we have to address both. I think land reform in and of itself is a crucially important issue that is haunting South Africa for a long time. It needs to be addressed. The land question is there. It is an expression of practical inequalities that persist and has massive consequences and that needs to be dealt with. At the same time, I think we should also look beyond and think about other ways in which basic needs and inequalities persist and need to be addressed beyond the land question. So I think if it is the case, and it surely is to some extent, that the land question is used symbolically as a political smokescreen for mobilization, we should resist these attempts to misuse the land question, dealing with the land question in the proper way, in proper ways, in the multiple ways that are relevant here, and also look beyond with regard to aspects that are being occluded. And I think it needs to be both taken together.
Yeah, thank you. Cherryl?
Yes, and I'd also be interested in what particularly our authors in the room would have to say in answer to the questioners as well in the discussion. I think in a way I've already addressed this, although you suggested I was using symbol somewhat differently from how you are. I think the land is a powerful symbol in many ways and can act as a lightning rod as a result. And had we been more successful, I have thought, in dealing with some of the other issues, like healthcare, like education, like right to the city, like housing, like employment, the land question might today, in the last 30 years, had we been more successful in dealing with those and making progress, visible progress that people felt, the land question might be less of a lightning rod today than it is at the moment. So I think it does, to some extent, it reflects failures in other areas. And that also speaks to the complexity which I struggle sometimes to articulate around land, because it can act as a symbol, it can act as a symbol for South Africa as a whole, but it also, for many people, at the same time, it comes down to maybe a particular piece of land that they lost, a home, an identity, a past, relationship. So it remains, it is really complicated in that kind of way. And then the challenge, though, is that we are dealing with actual land, an actual economy, an actual environment, and of course regional differences around that as well. And policy needs to address, to straddle those tensions that result from that. But yes, I think it is a lightning rod. I think it can be invoked and used politically in ways that are not necessarily aimed at resolving the land question ultimately. But the reason why it can be also speaks to the emotional meaning of that attaches to land and the particularities that people bring to the understanding of the land question as well, in particular family histories, community histories.
Thank you.
I don't have much more to add. It was just interesting listening to both of you. I actually thought about it, Cherryl, in the opposite way, and not that other things would be, if other issues were resolved, the land issue would be less, but if the land issue were resolved, other things would be less. So I'd actually seen it, kind of the other way around, and wondered if we had been much more attentive and much more, we had a capable state that expropriated when it could actually expropriate under the current regime, and we had, land reform taking place at the pace at which, we would be hopeful that it would take place, what would that have opened up for us in terms of having to address a number of the issues? So from my side, I think one needs to be careful with a question like that. I don't think definitely there is not a yes or no answer, and I would be careful not to diminish the value of land in opening up possibilities for emancipation with regard to other issues, whether it's health, whether, all the number of other issues. So I thought it was interesting when you both were talking that I could resonate with you up to a certain point, and then I thought you were going with one way, and then I thought, no, actually, I think I would have actually seen it the other way around. So yeah.
If I can just sort of comment on that and sort of reflecting. So on my own experience with trying to make land reform work. So I served on the Land Claims Commission for 5 years, 95 to 2000 in KwaZulu-Natal. And so a particular province and a particular time. But what, it's easy to say the land question is very complex as a way of sort of absolving oneself and the state and the government for responsibility. But trying to solve land claims 30, 40, 50 years after the original dispossession is extremely complex. It's multi-layered, there are often overlapping rights, overlapping claims, intergenerational disputes about what should happen, and the process of trying to act with administrative justice, to gather the information, to verify claims is extraordinarily complex. And I think that that does often get overlooked as well. It's not like they are just, in some cases it's quite simple, relatively simple. There's a sort of clear land right, there's a clear chain of evidence, and there are people who are in place to claim the land, and it can happen, but in many cases it's not. So it is time consuming, and I suppose that also has to be recognized in thinking how we could have moved more quickly.
Yeah. Thank you all. And thank you for your patience with the questions and also the way in which you responded. I wonder if there are authors in the room who might want to, just based on the discussion, by the way, I loved, another chapter I loved besides Dani's was, is it Sindisa Weeks?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a pity. It was a great chapter as well. But anybody else here? Professor Ruth Hall, you are a legend in this area. I'm going to give you the right to respond first to whatever you heard or might want to say, and so on and so forth. Is there a roving mic there that can...
Thank you so much, and thank you to the editors for pulling this together. It's an unusual book, and I think that it was a conference that for me was an unusual one because there was such a dialogue between lawyers and non-lawyers, and I think that was quite a feature of the book. We didn't all agree, which is fine. Yeah, I think that the one point, I think that in this conversation now, perhaps there are a few silences, and one is on the extent to which expropriation without compensation is not about expropriating particular properties, but is about a challenge to the entire property order and a call for state custodianship or nationalization. And the ambiguities around the actual meaning of EWC across different political parties and across a whole lot of people has been incredibly useful. And this obscuring of its meaning, I think, has been problematic but also productive for some interests. What I would say is I think that this question of what is just and equitable does need a lot more attention. Regardless of how land is to be acquired, the question of how justice can be advanced, I find it less problematic than you do. I think that it's incredibly important, and that justice, substantive fairness, can only be achieved through treating different people and different situations differently. And in that sense, my feeling is that the expropriation bill does not in any way resolve the debate that was happening. It skirts the issue by having a little section that says under certain circumstances, certain categories of land can be acquired without compensation. But what that doesn't do is, firstly, it doesn't clarify how different people have different entitlements and how different people need to be treated differently. So I think that that is a problem. But also, more importantly, what it does is it kicks the real political questions down the line to a state that can decide when and how to approach different situations differently. So I think that the potency of the EWC debate was so much that it was citizens broadly calling into question the political settlement and making claims on the state. And the way in which I see the ANC, particularly in this period, as having navigated this, was to largely recast it as a technical legal question, to delay the process of the constitutional vote, which conveniently then was delayed until during the COVID era. But importantly, to focus on the question of the relationship between the state and property owners. And I think that the power and the potential for conversations like this is to refocus the debate, not on the relationship between the state and property owners, but between the state and the majority of South Africans who don't have recognized and secure land rights. So I think that the invoking of the right of equitable access is where the potential way forward goes. And one of the points that Bulelwa made, Mabasa, is that actually as universities, we are not doing enough to train the next generation around, for instance, land law, property law. It's a minor issue in our universities. I think that that's also a sort of on our to-do list, to have wider conversations across universities about curricula. You should be pleased. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No? Yes, sorry. Hi, thank you. Thank you to the editors as well for sort of shepherding us through this process. Just to pick up on one or two things and to ally with what Ruth was saying, sort of the nationalization sort of ghost also haunts this debate. And I think it's very much about a kind of lazy state-centric thinking about transformation, which has been deeply encoded into our political DNA. It goes back to the Freedom Charter and so on. And I think what I enjoyed about this process, the conference, and putting this book together with the lawyers kind of rethinking the property regime, and those of us who are outside of that, also coming at sort of property relations from a very different perspective. I really think, and for me, what was striking is trying to think property relations beyond individualized property relations, which is a kind of colonial inheritance, but also to think property relations beyond just the state owning everything, but to introduce the idea of the commons. And I think that also tries to shift the debate dramatically. Can the state think as a commoner? I think is a very fundamental question. And that relates to what you were raising, the two things you raised around, where is state capacity in all of this? In the kind of activism and the work that I'm busy with around food sovereignty, commoning in townships and villages and communities, my own university, where we feed 1,000 students a day, with several gardens and a communal kitchen and so on. What's happening there is that we're beginning to realize that we need a new conception of politics. And so the idea of democratic systemic reforms is something that's being introduced into the debate, which means that, again, it's not the complicated machinery of the state and adjudicating claims and so on, but it's how we kind of driving this process from below. So people own this process, etc. We haven't done that in South Africa. So that's the one thing. And the last thing I'll just say is around reconciliation. So for me, the past and its injustices are actually meeting a terrifying future, which is climate change. And that's what I try to do with my chapter, is situate those two challenges. And what it generates is a bigger question. I mean, what kind of food system do we need to survive in the world that we're going into? And I think that's kind of where, we got to think about the transition and its complexity. For commercial farmers, that's one part of the transition, and this is where many of us are talking about the idea of bringing subsidies back into the national debate. How do you incentivize these farmers who are not going to survive? In the drought that we've just come through, many of them were bankrupted and so on. But if we bring subsidies into the debate, these are subsidies that will be conditional. They will prompt them to restore the land because we've damaged our land. There's ecological devastation. These are subsidies that should incentivize them to transition from mono-industrial farming. And these are subsidies that should incentivize them to think about how to deconcentrate. And that's one leg of the transition envisaged in the activism I'm involved with. But I think it breaks new ground, and it thinks about reconciliation very, very differently from a politics of hate. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just worried about giving broader participation. So could I ask, having listened to two of our colleagues, could the rest of you be shorter so that the non authors can also have a say, okay? All right.
I will be short.
Thank you, ma'am.
I was struck by the question, what would have happened if we have progressed more with regard to land reform? And that got me thinking about Daniels versus Cripanti, that judgment where Justice Cameron said, we will not be able to go forward if we do not deal with history. So history is reality, the different levels, what happened, that reality that you lost your land. But it's much more than that. There's also at an overarching level, connecting court processes, judgments, the department, getting everyone involved. So the different levels of complexity and how they all intermingle so that we actually can go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. Where's Bulelwa?
She's hiding in the back.
Bulelwa, could you contribute?
Thank you very much. I was sitting quietly because I actually just want to absorb the room and all the thinking. I think my views have been well shared in different fora, but I think the most important part for me that still needs to be probed is what happens. We know that the state is not necessarily capacitated. And we know that the Constitution in Section 25 makes it the business of the state to deliver land reform. But I think what is the thing that we have not explored enough of is the ability of citizens, whether you're a landowner or somebody with land, you're a CPA or you're a community trust, the extent to which those conceivably divergent forces are able amongst themselves to take matters into their own hands to deliver the thing that we all want to see, this redistributive justice. I think the over-reliance, gone are the days where we should be sitting and lamenting state incapacity. I agree very much with what Vishwas has said, to say what other modalities and modes of delivering land reform can be available, are available amongst these, and I think that's one aspect of reconciliation. It is, in fact, exploring the presence and willingness of people who may be landowners, who are saying, we want to be part of the solution. I have land, I have the skills, I have the resources. And those communities that are sitting without those skills and without those, and I think we teased that idea at the Presidential Advisory Land Reform Panel, which I formed a part of together with Ruth and some others, where we said, where is the scope in the current policy framework that allows for land donations? So we all speak about this topic as if it is inherently dichotomous, or that it's inherently conflicting. But we haven't actually done enough to see ways in which we should be having a policy framework that puts these together in the name of reconciliation. So for me, that's one interesting thing. And Ruth is correct around my thinking around being a lawyer that studied at university and only having had a chapter of land reform that has been covered in studies that go through 5 years of study, but then land reform is a little chapter which to me I've always found problematic. And I think lastly, I have so many ideas and thinking, but I think I'm not gonna obviously take up the entire evening, but I think lastly, we should be talking about different forms of tenure security. And we should be finding solutions. We know the problems. We know that it's dichotomous. We know that communal land versus urban land, I mean, we've diagnosed these problems at length. I think where the discussion should be now is how do we form tenure security structures that are fit for purpose, whether or not somebody lives in the middle of Hillbrow or in a communal, property in rural KZN. So I think that's where the movement should be.
Right. We're running out of time. We probably have a minute left. I have a few concluding comments as a non-land expert, listening to all of you. Is there any other non-author that might want to? Yes, ma'am. There's two people here.
Thank you. The non-authors are the controversial people in the room, so apologies for that. Yeah, I think that I really look forward to the book, and thanks for the efforts you put in. I miss one word in the land question, and I feel that it shouldn't be a question. It should be land struggle. And only that's going to take us forward. So the land question is also framed in the constitutional framework, which is the very thing that has us stuck. So this property's sunset clause will never give us the openings. And so it's only through struggle that, and we haven't framed that kind of politics. So the politics here, it's all in the framework of the current state, paradigm. So I would like to challenge us to move beyond this. And why does that have to be another book? That the struggle and how do we get away from this? Why? And this, it's convenient to only focus on the question, because we can intellectualize without being outside, being thrown away, being evicted from farms, outside in the cold where nobody, and the women who have to sit in abusive relationships because the next piece of land or house is 500 miles away. So you cannot get away from you. So our communities are sitting stuck. And it reminds me of the debate, are we doing poverty reduction or are we doing poverty eradication? So yes, 2% poverty reduction, yes, we have achieved that. Very good. Yeah, 5% land reform, not transformation. Yes, we've done that. We're ticking boxes. And we need to move beyond. And like the fees must fall has thrown us over because we were also constitutionalizing with the right to education. The same will happen if we, in our studies, in our intellectualization, in our authorships, we do not include struggle as an integral part of our reasoning.
Gotcha. Thank you. And you have the last word, sir, and then I'm going to close. I'm under strict instructions.
Thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening, and I'm certainly going to get the book. And I'm a former sociologist in the Department of Sociology at Stellenbosch. I've got a very simple question, which flows from the talk that I heard next to me. Did any of the authors identify a land reform project or example that was just in redistributive terms, either in the former homelands, Bantustans, or in the Karoo, or in commercial agricultural land? Did any of the authors identify a success beyond EWC in terms of redistributive justice? Thank you.
Thank you. That's it. I'm now going to ask the editors to just make concluding comments, and you might reflect also on what happened here and the questions asked. So we start with Zsa-Zsa and come down to Olaf.
I think you raise a really important question that I think it's sad that we're not talking about this more, and that is the legitimacy of Section 25. I think what has perhaps not been the focus of the discussion around expropriation without compensation, but definitely something that needs to be prioritized is a lot of questions around the legitimacy. Who does Section 25 actually protect? And I'm beginning to see a lot of questions around that actually in the space in which, perhaps in the legal space of asking the question of the interests that we view as can be protected not only at common law, but Section 25 itself. And I think more and more we have to begin to ask those questions, and those questions were not pertinent on the table with expropriation without compensation. Yes, they were a byproduct of asking the question of are we in the regime of custodianship or are we in nationalization? Yes, it was by the way, but I think more and more these are the types of questions that we begin to ask when we see how Section 25 is playing out and who Section 25 is protecting and who common law property, if I can put it in that, private property rights are protecting, which is why I went back to some of the chapters, some of the initial chapters that really actually engage that question of how stifled our discussion around expropriation without compensation was because we are having that narrow focus. And to the contrary, there are overlapping interests that are not recognized. And I think a lot of the earlier chapters try to address that of what is lacking. And I think that's exactly what, or at least the point that you are trying to make in terms of that. And I do think we need to prioritize that because it's an important question. What is the purpose of Section 25? And yes, we can go back to the constitutionalization debates. And I think we should go back to the constitutionalization debates to ask, what was the purpose intended in terms of Section 25 initially? But I do also agree with Almine Duplessis' take on the fact that a constitution is a living document, and it may be that we need to renegotiate the terms right now in terms of what Section 25 was designed to do and how it's playing out in those individual eviction cases or those individual communal rights in those cases where the transformative potential just doesn't realize in the case of women. And there are various examples. So yeah, maybe I'll close with that.
Thank you. Just to respond to Simon's question about success stories, I think there are some, and I'd have to I'm looking to Zsa-Zsa. Some of the case studies that are identified in the legal section refer to some partial successes, maybe some relief, etc., that has been won in particular cases through the way in which the Constitution and case law was interpreted. In the land reform section, I think there's not a great focus on case studies. I mean, there's a large literature on case studies of land reform. And perhaps the one chapter that does deal with some partial success stories is actually William, who is South African, William Barnard's chapter, but he's looking at some success stories, relative success stories within the realm of commercial agriculture, in fact, and partnerships between commercial farmers and some of the what do you call them, the production co-ops, etc., and small growers, etc. So there are some of that. But what I would like to conclude with, really, in terms of the book is, first of all, to say it's open access. I don't know if that's been mentioned, so it's free to download. So we've only skimmed the surface of some of the issues that are raised and in all the various chapters. It's a particular book. I think it's an important intervention, actually, that is bringing a range of debates together. But of course, it's not doing justice to the full range of issues. But I think for me, what's important about it is the way in which it's also moving towards trying to think in 2024, 2025, what does redistributive justice mean and what is the contribution of land reform to that? And there are differences of opinion amongst the authors, I think, around the relative importance of land. One of the questions that we raise in the introduction is the need to make hard choices, to face up to hard choices, to prioritize. And it comes back to the question around the role of the state. The question around the state versus popular politics is raised as well, and Vish also touched on that in terms of where should the emphasis lie? What is the role of the state vis-a-vis popular politics and the private sector? And there's a debate, which you will see if you read the chapters around that. But it is looking at, from my perspective, saying land reform is important for all sorts of reasons, but it's only part of the story. It's one plank in a larger quest for redistributive justice. And what does that mean? How do we get there? What else must we be thinking about, or some of the questions that are raised?
Thank you.
Well, taking up from Cherryl, really, I think because this whole book starts off from expropriation without compensation, which in this narrow definition is a state-centric conceptualization. Maybe our discussion creates the impression that we are only discussing state-centric debates, but I think, as Cherryl just pointed out, we should stress the beyond before the expropriation without compensation. It's really a book which tries to do both. So a selling point for the book is really, there's lots of popular politics in there already, and much more to follow in the sequel, I guess. So it's great that you want to buy the book, but as Cherryl pointed out, you don't have to. You can just scan the QR code and then get the book for free. And that is actually possible, that's actually the occasion I want to use here, is to a very large extent due to STIAS, which we want to thank wholeheartedly, who supported us from the very beginning back since 2018 until today, by also hosting this wonderful book launch here and by making possible, together with the National Research Foundation and the support from our home universities, to get this book published in our capitalist world for free, which, as you know, is hardly impossible. Thank you very much.
Except, of course, it isn't free. Somebody pays. I just want to conclude by just, if I may, by the way, Ruth, you don't actually know what I think. I was just here to facilitate a discussion with hopefully interesting questions. I have my own views on some of these issues. But I want to thank Zsa-Zsa. You made a really, really important point, and that point is to not think about the issues of land reform, etc., as inherently conflictual. There are more than enough cases. When I was at the University of the Free State, Vice Chancellor, I was forced to go to something called, not Nando's, was it NAMDO? Or something like that in the Eastern Free State. And I was actually quite amazed to see how many of those farmers in places like Bethlehem and so on, didn't approach this as antagonistic at all. They said, you've lived on my farm for so many generations. How can you start taking over part of this farm, and what can I provide in terms of equipment and training and support and so on? That to me seems like a wonderful way to think about it. It might not be ubiquitous, but it is a wonderful way to think of this as not simply imposition from some quarter. And I do take the point that several people have made too, and I think this is a problem for all of us as academics. If you look at the land question only through a policy lens or a legal lens or a constitutional lens more broadly, you miss, as you correctly say, the other potential lenses, one of which is what is the role of activism? Worldwide, South America, take your pick, in driving land reform from the bottom up, the colleague over there said, etc. And then I want to end with you, sir. I don't know you, but you made a very important point, which I hear increasingly at conferences these days. So we're talking about this with a lot of intensity and commitment and so on, and that's correct. But what if we're not around because of other things that are overtaking us? The climate change issue being one that's very important. I'm glad that one of the editors, Edward Kiromira, is a very modest man, a very accomplished man, but a very modest man. But every now and again, I go over to his seminars that they have here. If you're a fellow, you must attend one of those seminars. But actually, the reason I go is they make the best lunches that you will get this side of the Zambezi. But I mean, it's absolutely amazing. I always wanted to be in a university where if I go at lunchtime, there'd be a seminar on nuclear physics. The next day I go, there's a seminar on land reform. The next day I go there. You see, that's what a university really is about. The managerialists in our universities think it's about, admissions and dealing with all this racist shit, in the residences here and that kind of thing. That's not actually what a university is for. A university is for to be an intellectual hotbed, a place where you can debate, a place where we can disagree and still have a beer afterwards. That's what a university is. And I just want to thank STIAS for creating that opportunity. A round of applause for All right. Thank you for inviting me. As in most places where I get invited, I never get invited back again, but who the hell cares? It was a great session with you.
From STIAS' side, thank you to you as well for your steady hand in guiding the conversation. Olaf, Cherryl, Zsa-Zsa, you pulled this through. This is a long-term project that survived COVID, and congratulations. Clearly, you've achieved what it is set out to do, namely to open a debate about the beyond. Thank you.
Thank you.